Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th Hour. This week, we talk about the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Trump's wavering on a peaceful transfer of power, and de Blasio and Cuomo's continued stewardship of New York under coronavirus. The 25th Hour is taking a break next week, but look out for us on social media. Now, things may have changed by the time you hear this. In New York, schools are still in disarray a week before in-school classes are starting. In Staten Island, there are 50 staff members from IS-81 who are isolating themselves after a staff member tested positive for coronavirus following a staff meeting. No students were in the building with the infected staff member. The mayor defended not having enough teachers before in-person classes starting next week in a testy exchange with WNYC's Brian Lehrer.
Well, if you won't release a number of how many more teachers you need to hire or get in place by next Tuesday or next Thursday, are the chances greater than zero that you will have to delay in-person school again over staffing?
There's no reason to delay. That's the easiest way to say it. I'm monitoring this constantly, talking with the union leadership every day. We're all watching the specifics together because this is unprecedented. It's never been attempted before. I feel very good. The pieces keep coming together hour by hour, and we are ready to go for Tuesday and ready to go for Thursday.
You're saying there's a zero chance that staffing would be a cause
Brian,
for
the
further
problem,
delay.
I don't do hypotheticals because we are dealing with the healthcare dynamics and everything else. I'm not going to do that, and I don't think that's productive.
I'm just saying
I'm
there's
telling
a
people.
zero chance
I'm just
that
telling you what
staffing.
The truth is that we are getting the people we need in place, period.
The mayor did furlough himself and his staff for a week, announcing also that the furlough includes 9,000 managerial and non-union city staff, saying that hopefully the move would save the city about $21 million. School superintendents and non-union staff were included in the furlough, despite the school chaos. Teachers had to come into school buildings earlier as part of the school reopening plan, even if there were no kids in the building. But a new deal with the union allows teachers to work from home after all. As if that wasn't enough, Department of Education Chancellor Richard Carranza was yelled at by the Board of Elections Chairman Michael Ryan because of last-minute objections by the DOE in using 20 schools and 9 daycares as polling places. The mayor had announced that outdoor dining will be permanent, so if you had started to really like this arrangement with indoor dining being banned and restaurants adapting to the situation at hand by placing seats outside, it looks like outdoor dining will be here to stay. And it's still to be seen how restaurants will adapt to colder weather and whether any of that type of conversion from outdoor seating to using tarps and blankets and enclosing those spaces for warmth, whether that is going to have any effect on increased coronavirus numbers as well.
That we will make the Open Restaurants Initiative permanent and year-round. And this is something that a lot of folks in the restaurant industry have said, could we find a way to build upon this success? I want us to go for the gold here. I want us to, really take this model and make it part of the life of New York City for years and generations to come. This has been, I think, an extraordinarily positive experiment, and it's worked.
Orthodox neighborhoods are seeing emergency inspections in yeshivas after a rise in coronavirus numbers. New York City Health Commissioner David Chokshi also said that all private schools in parts of Brooklyn and Queens are required to enforce 6 feet social distancing and wearing of masks. This is all following the news that 6 neighborhoods are the sites of increased coronavirus clusters, including Williamsburg, Kew Gardens, Edgemere Far Rockaway, Midwood, Borough Park, and Bensonhurst. De Blasio sparred with Cuomo again, this time about police reform after the governor criticized de Blasio's police reform efforts. De Blasio said that the governor does not have his facts straight.
And he referred to the problem of rising crime in the city and related it to the slow progress that he sees on reinventing the police. One more tiny clip.
If you don't do it, everybody gets hurt.
Mr. Mayor, your response to the governor.
He doesn't have his facts straight. It's just quite clear. And look, if he wants to make personal attacks, he can do that. But he does not have his facts straight. 7 years of nonstop reform. And it's time we have an honest conversation about this and stop these games. We, in the year 2019, had 180,000 fewer arrests in New York City than the last year of the Bloomberg administration. We created a strategy to reduce unnecessary arrests while driving down crime. We created a strategy to end mass incarceration. The governor didn't do that. The state didn't do that. We did that. We have an incarceration level in this city now, you have to go back to the 1940s to have so few people in jail. We put in place retraining of the entire NYPD, de-escalation training. In the year 2018, there were only 17 instances in which an NYPD officer fired their weapon in an adversarial situation. 17 an entire year for the biggest police force in the country. That came from retraining and new strategies.
And following the news of the governor and the mayor sparring about this sort of thing, news came out that a program meant to teach officers how to de-escalate tensions with mentally ill individuals was abruptly stopped last week. Protests against police brutality sparked up again after news was released that only one police officer involved in the Breonna Taylor shooting was indicted, and it wasn't even for any of the shots that were in Taylor's home when she was shot and killed in her own bed on March 13th, 2020. De Blasio responded to Trump's declaration of New York City being an anarchist jurisdiction, which was an attempt by the Trump administration to defund cities it sees as not upholding law and order by saying that the move was only meant to divide people.
I was out in Elmhurst, Queens this morning. I saw peace, tranquility. I saw people going about their business, people excited that it's the first day of school. I saw anything but anarchy. So this is just another one of President Trump's games. It's thoroughly political. It's part of his campaign strategy. It makes no sense. It's not based in the facts in the least. It's insulting to the people of New York City, and his effort to withhold our funding is unconstitutional.
The whole anarchist jurisdiction scenario was a way for Trump's Department of Justice to define certain cities as those that are not supporting police efforts in controlling protests against police brutality, and any attempts by those city legislatures to defund police, quote unquote. It ironically seeks to defund cities who are defunding the police, then creating the result of defunding police in general by withholding federal funds. Upper West Siders who sought to get rid of homeless men living at the Lucerne Hotel are ultimately getting what they wanted. De Blasio is set to relocate the remaining 300 homeless men to a shelter in downtown Manhattan. Those at the Harmonia Hotel who were threatened to be displaced as a result of neighborhood protests will also be able to stay put. Moving on to the city council, there was a big splash in the news this week when Council Speaker Corey Johnson announced that he will be dropping out of the 2021 mayoral race, citing his battle with depression.
In a statement explaining his decision not to run for mayor after all, City Council Speaker Corey Johnson noted he's been dealing with some personal challenges over the past few months, namely depression. On Twitter, he said he was advised not to disclose this, but further went on to say, too often mental health issues are shrouded in secrecy and stigmas, which causes people struggling with these issues to feel alone. I encourage anyone who is experiencing a mental health condition to seek help. I did, and I am better for it.
Bringing back memories of Amazon's withdrawal from New York City, the proposed rezoning of Industry City in Brooklyn was dropped after what Industry City CEO Andrew Kimball said was a lack of political will. The rezoning was meant to expand the business district in the neighborhood and promised 20,000 jobs and more businesses, while opponents decried empty promises and potential gentrification, driving out residents currently living in Industry City. At the heart of the opposition was Councilman Carlos Menchaca.
I spoke with workers and residents and business owners in Sunset Park. I made it very clear that I would not support Industry City's rezoning unless certain conditions were met. Those conditions were not met. Industry City's rezoning will make it harder for working people to live in Sunset Park. And our city land use process, well, it favors corporate developers as they profit off the displacement of working class New Yorkers. So I strongly oppose this application and will vote no if it comes before the City Council. In fact, I'm asking that Industry City officially remove their rezoning application before the mayor restarts the ULURP clock next month.
Moving on to Governor Cuomo. Cuomo said that there will be a statue of Ruth Bader Ginsburg put up in her honor.
New York will honor Justice Ginsburg with a statue in her birthplace, Midwood, Brooklyn. Governor Cuomo will appoint a commission to select an artist and oversee the location selection process. The governor also announced landmarks across New York, including the World Trade Center, will be lit in blue.
In Buffalo, a 25-year-old woman was arrested after driving her car into a crowd of Breonna Taylor protesters. The governor also responded to Trump's declaring New York City as an anarchist jurisdiction, saying the move was just continued manipulation and threatened to sue Trump. Trump and Cuomo continued their feud, extending into areas such as whether a vaccine will be rolled out normally in the state. Cuomo, saying that he doesn't trust Trump's vaccine rollout, said that he would slow down its release in the state. Trump responded, saying that New Yorkers should trust Cuomo's vaccine plans like they trusted his nursing home policies, referring to state policies that arguably allowed nursing home residents to die from COVID in their facilities rather than being moved into a hospital. Attorney General Letitia James suggested that police officers not be the ones to do the boring traffic enforcement they always do, in order to prevent heated encounters, like one in the Bronx that ended in the shooting death of Alan Feliz last October. Feliz was pulled over by an officer for a seatbelt violation, but after warrants were discovered, Feliz tried escaping in his car while threatening the officers and was subsequently shot. Moving on to Albany, calls for the federal government to step in and bail out New York are holding steady. The executive of Suffolk County, Steve Ballone, called on Congress to institute disaster relief for New York, treating COVID as a disaster and offsetting budget deficits that happened as a result. There are calls for lawmakers to return to Albany to deal with the state's fiscal crisis, but Election Day being so soon prevents lawmakers from making the necessary cuts to balance the budget. Nobody wants to see their name in an ad cutting education funding in a way to balance the budget before Election Day. Assemblyman Daniel Rosenthal put his hat in the ring to replace outgoing Queens Councilman Rory Lansman, who recently announced he's stepping down, joining 7 other candidates in the race. For all of the talk about 2020 being an important election, the state legislature is floundering on making voting easier. A bill meant to allow voters to register online a lot easier will not be able to pass in time before the state registration deadline. Moving on to the state courts, the president's niece, Mary Trump, filed a case in Manhattan State Supreme Court accusing the president, his sister Marianne, and his deceased brother Robert of fraud and conspiracy, namely cheating Mary out of her inheritance worth tens of millions of dollars. Mary Trump recently wrote a memoir detailing her life in the Trump family, exploring the president's childhood and upbringing to identify the source of what she calls his narcissism. Manhattan Supreme Court Judge Joan A. Madden ordered an inquiry into the death of Eric Garner and whether city officials had any role in covering up its subsequent investigation. Garner's infamous cry of "I can't breathe" became the rallying cry for Black Lives Matter protesters after Garner's death following a police chokehold. Moving on to President Trump. The president refused this week to directly say whether there would be a peaceful transfer of power if Biden wins, saying mail-in ballots will make the election fraudulent.
Mr. President, real quickly, win, lose, or draw in this election, will you commit here today for a peaceful transferal of power after the election? There has been rioting in Louisville, there's been rioting in many cities across this country, red and your so-called red and blue states. Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
I understand that, but people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it. And you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
Biden called Trump's words a distraction. The president has seized on mail-in ballots, claiming erroneously that the voting method leads to widespread vote fraud. Exacerbating the issue is a case in Pennsylvania where 9 military ballots were found discarded. The DOJ took the extraordinary step to reveal that 7 of those ballots were for Trump, with Attorney General Bill Barr personally briefing Trump on the situation, spurring calls that the DOJ is providing the president with campaign material to prove his debunked voter fraud theory. A state investigation quickly found that an inexperienced seasonal contractor handling the carriage of those ballots mistakenly threw out the 9 ballots because the envelopes looked like those for applications and not ballots themselves. The two men are set to debate in the first presidential debate on September 29th. Biden has been receiving some interesting endorsements this week, including 500 mostly retired generals and admirals, some of whom worked under Trump. Olivia Troy, Pence's former aide, also endorsed Biden, saying Trump has a callous view of human life. Following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Trump plans to nominate Amy Coney Barrett to replace her. Barrett, 48, is currently a judge on the 7th Circuit, holding conservative views on abortion, gun rights, and health care.
I clerked for Justice Scalia more than 20 years ago, but the lessons I learned still resonate. His judicial philosophy is mine too. A judge must apply the law as written. Judges are not policymakers, and they must be resolute in setting aside any policy views they might hold. The President has asked me to become the 9th Justice, and as it happens, I'm used to being in a group of 9, my family. But this evening, I also want to acknowledge you, my fellow Americans. If confirmed, I would not assume that role for the sake of those in my own circle, and certainly not for my own sake. I would assume this role to serve you. I would discharge the judicial oath, which requires me to administer justice without respect to persons, do equal right to the poor and rich, and faithfully and impartially discharge my duties under the United States Constitution.
On abortion, Barrett has expressed views saying she would overturn Roe v. Wade, allowing states carte blanche to institute their own abortion restrictions. On gun rights, Barrett had said earlier that even laws banning felons from owning guns might be unconstitutional. And Democrats are worried that Barrett would allow the complete dismantling of the Affordable Care Act. A recent court case had said that the Affordable Care Act's provision preventing insurance companies from not counting pre-existing conditions had made the entire law invalid. And the Supreme Court is set to take on that case soon. And with a Barrett replacing Ginsburg's seat, Democrats are worried that Barrett would join those saying that the ACA is invalid and would strike down the law entirely without a Republican replacement. Trump continued to say a coronavirus vaccine could potentially be out before the election, questioning the effectiveness of face masks and publicly disputing his head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, who had said if Americans wore masks more frequently, the pandemic could be under control. The CDC got in trouble for taking off guidance that said anyone who was around even an asymptomatic carrier of COVID should get tested, over scientists' objections. The agency put the guidance back up with a change. If you've been around asymptomatic carriers for more than 15 minutes, then get tested. Attorney General Bill Barr turned heads this week when he attacked his own prosecutors, calling them children, comparing quarantine lockdowns to slavery, and calling for protesters to be charged with sedition.
In an unusually harsh attack from the boss, the Attorney General says career prosecutors can become so determined to bring criminal charges, they stretch the law, going after people, not crimes. He said they need supervision from politically appointed leaders.
Individual prosecutors can sometimes become headhunters. It's all too often. They're consumed with taking down their target. Letting the most junior members set the agenda might be a good philosophy for a Montessori preschool, but it is no way to run a federal agency.
He didn't mention any specific cases, but he's been criticized for moving to drop the prosecution of former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and for seeking a lighter sentence for former Trump campaign advisor Roger Stone. Barr says it's wrong to call that interference.
What do you mean by interfere? Under the law, all prosecutorial power is vested in the Attorney General.
But some former prosecutors say Barr isn't even-handed when overruling line prosecutors.
The principles articulated by the Attorney General are appropriate, but he fails miserably in the execution. He continues to weigh in on behalf of friends and allies of the president. Deeply disturbing and inappropriate.
In his speech to a conservative college, Barr also said state pandemic restrictions like stay-at-home orders amount to house arrest.
Other than slavery, which was a different kind of restraint, this is the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in American history.
Despite Barr's rhetoric, the Justice Department has actually gone to court to challenge only a few state COVID restrictions, most of them involving limits on church attendance.
After a massive outpouring of protests from lawmakers against the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe reversed his position on not briefing congressional leaders in person on election security threats. He had recently issued a statement saying that lawmakers would only be getting a written update about any potential threats to election security ahead of the 2020 election. Trump is sending about 100 troops to Syria after small encounters with Russian forces there led to U.S. military injuries. Continued skirmishes with Russian troops in Syria have led to worries among lawmakers and the public about the U.S. role in the area. An envelope filled with ricin, a poisonous powder, was intercepted by law enforcement meant for the president. A woman was arrested near the Canadian border who is accused of sending that letter. Moving on to Congress. In the House still does not have a deal, as of the time of this recording, to stave off a funding crisis before funding runs out on September 30th. The plan currently is to pass a continuing resolution which continues government funding at the same levels until December 11th. A new House Oversight Committee report said that because of Trump's pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, 400,000 more people can potentially die over the next decade as a result. Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that House lawmakers are expected to stick around until a deal is made regarding coronavirus relief. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer later clarified by saying lawmakers are on call and wouldn't have to physically stay in D.C. Moving on to the Senate, all eyes are on the Senate as Trump prepares to formally announce the nomination of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement. Senators that earlier said they wouldn't push through a new Supreme Court nominee close to a presidential election are backtracking, including Senator Lindsey Graham, who said this in 2016.
This is the last year of a lame duck president, and if Ted Cruz or Donald Trump get to be president, they've all asked us not to confirm or take up a selection by President Obama. So if a vacancy occurs in their last year of their first term, guess what? You will use their words against them. I want you to use my words against me. If there's a Republican president in 2016 and a vacancy occurs in the last year of the first term, you can say, Lindsey Graham said, let's let the next president, whoever it might be, make that nomination, and you could use my words against me and you'd be absolutely right.
Senate Republicans are facing calls of hypocrisy because Mitch McConnell infamously never gave Obama's nominee Merrick Garland a hearing 12 months out from the 2016 election, saying that the American people need to choose the next president who would in turn choose the next nominee. But now, less than 2 months out from the next election, McConnell pledged to hold a hearing on a nominee not even an hour after RBG died. A Washington Post ABC poll found that 57% of Americans oppose replacing RBG before the election. And speaking of Lindsey Graham, he's facing a tough election fight in his native South Carolina, even going so far as begging for campaign donations on Fox News. The senator has come a far way from being John McCain's closest colleague on the Senate floor to what critics say is now being a Trump sycophant. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee voted down party lines to authorize subpoenas in investigations related to the transition period between Trump's election and inauguration. Former FBI Director James Comey and former Director of National Security James Clapper were included in those subpoenas. The Senate Homeland Security and Finance Committees also issued reports exploring the issue of Joe Biden's son Hunter's involvement with the Ukrainian gas company and how that affected Obama-era relations with Ukraine. The report, despite promising damning findings, fell to a dud, containing no evidence that Biden manipulated Ukrainian foreign policy because of his son, and even contained witness testimony arguing against the charge. Chairman of the committee Ron Johnson overhyped the report, saying it established Biden's unfitness for office despite there being absolutely no evidence. Moving on to the judicial field. Ruth Bader Ginsburg died from pancreatic cancer at 87. The legendary jurist became the first woman and Jewish American to lie in state in the Capitol. Her story is one of inspiration. She came up from Brooklyn, New York, eventually joining a class of 9 women in Harvard Law. Ginsburg's body of work focused on gender equality and fighting for legal parity for men and women. The former ACLU lawyer was nominated to the court by Bill Clinton, joining the court as the second female appointed after Sandra Day O'Connor. After a decade serving on the court, Ginsburg's reputation in the public grew, eventually becoming known as the notorious RBG. The judges of the Second Circuit in Manhattan met Trump's lawyers with skepticism when the president's lawyers tried arguing that the Manhattan District Attorney's subpoenas for Trump's tax returns were overbroad, including repeating arguments that were shot down by the Supreme Court earlier this year, saying that Trump has absolute immunity while he's president. The Supreme Court rejected that argument, and yet Trump still is fighting the subpoenas for his tax records in federal court, saying that the Manhattan District Attorney's rationale for those tax returns was overbroad following a grand jury investigation. A Ninth Circuit panel voted 2-1 to allow Trump to deport nearly 400,000 refugees from El Salvador, Haiti, Sudan, and other countries that fled their countries due to natural disasters and wars. Trump's lawyers argued that the program that allowed those refugees to stay in the U.S. was never meant to be permanent and is set to end in March of next year. An appeal to the entire 11-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit is in development. A D.C. District Court judge ruled that the temporary head of the Bureau of Land Management, William Perry Pendley, had been serving illegally for the past year and ousted him from office. Montana Governor Steve Bullock filed the lawsuit claiming that Pendley was never confirmed by the Senate, thus serving illegally. The case was an important campaign issue for the governor, as Montana voters see the sale of transfer of federal public lands as a key issue. Judge Stanley Bastian of the Eastern District Court of Washington State issued an injunction against the USPS from making any more changes to the mail service, which led to increased slowdowns in mail delivery and led to an outcry against the USPS Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. And finally, we end with grim national news as the country hit the grim milestone of passing 200,000 coronavirus deaths. That concludes our show for this week. Please stay safe, everybody. Register to vote. And make sure you check your registration deadlines by state. We leave this week's show with this speech from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please rate, review, comment, and share this podcast wherever you get your podcast with your friends. Share us, make us widely known. We are becoming one of the top political podcasts. Thank you, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
I am, as you know, a Brooklynite, born and bred. A first-generation American on my father's side, barely second generation on my mother's. Neither of my parents had the means to attend college. What has become of me could happen only in America, like so many others. I owe so much to the entry this nation afforded to people yearning to breathe free. My law school class in the late 1950s numbered over 500. That class included less than 10 women.
I thought it could be a way to make a living, plus to do something that would make conditions in your society a little better.
There was another student at Cornell.
Yes.
Who decided to become a lawyer too.
Yeah, my dear husband.
Your dear husband.
Yeah, in fact, we had decided that whatever we do it together.
Not a law firm in the entire city of New York bid for my employment as a lawyer when I earned my degree.
There were many well-known firms in New York that were not yet up to welcoming Jews. The next, I was a woman. That was a higher barrier. But the absolute killer was I had a 4-year-old daughter. So when I graduated from law school, there was not a single woman on any federal bench. It would not be a realistic ambition for a woman to want to become a federal judge. Jimmy Carter became our president. He looked around at the federal judiciary and said, I am determined to appoint members of minority groups and women to the federal bench. One of my law clerks at the Court of Appeals said at the time that Clinton was considering who would be his first nominee to the court. He said, you will be on the list, but you'll probably be around number 25.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive. People like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Tubman. I stand on the shoulders of those brave people.
The court wasn't an unknown territory to me. I mean, I worked at the Court of Appeals. I knew Justice Scalia from our Court of Appeals days together. I knew Justice Clarence Thomas, who was also on the D.C. Circuit. But Sandra was as close as I came to having a big sister. You know, the standard robe is made for a man because it has a place for the shirt to show and the tie. So Sandra Day O'Connor and I thought it would be appropriate if we included it as part of our robe, something typical of a woman. When Sandra left, it was a very lonely place for me to be. That is, eight rather well-fed men up there. And then there was a small little woman. It was the wrong perception.
Yeah. In my lifetime, I expect to see 3, 4, perhaps even more women on the High Court bench, women not shaped from the same mold, but of different complexions.
People ask me sometimes, when will there be enough women on the court? And my answer is, when there are 9. Because I've been there so long, I sit next to the chief, and to the left, some seats down, is Justice Sotomayor, and to the right, Justice Kagan. We're all over the bench. We're 1/3 of the bench. But there has been a tradition in the United States of dissents becoming the law of the land. You're writing for a future age, and your hope is that with time, the court will see it the way you do. The notorious RBG was started by a second-year student at New York University Law School. She was dismayed about the decision the court had recently rendered, where she put on the internet the announcement I made from the bench of my dissenting opinion in the Shelby County case. And she called it the notorious RBG because she had in mind a well-known rapper, the notorious B.I.G. I love my job. It's the best and the hardest job that I have ever had. And it has kept me going through 4 cancer bouts. Instead of concentrating on my aches and pains, I just know that I have to read this set of briefs and concentrate on the court's work.